Hello and welcome. My name is Kim Peretti, and I'm a partner here at Alston & Bird and co-chair of Alston's Cybersecurity Preparedness and Response Team. Alston's cyber practice is scattered throughout our offices in the U.S. and Europe and handles a wide range of U.S. and global data security incidents or issues, including incident response and increasingly more cybersecurity preparedness counseling. We are thrilled to be presenting this webinar today. There are about 200 participants that joined on the webinar, and we have a room here in Washington, D.C., so we're pleased that so many also consider reasonable security to be a topic worthy of your time. The issue of reasonable security has become increasingly important. One trend we've seen is for both regulators and business partners to be making significant requests of companies that bear on the relative maturity of a company's cybersecurity program and to expect responses in a short and tight time frame. And importantly, we are also seeing these requests include a requirement for supporting documentation. It's really a show me, not just don't just tell me, but show me type of request. And I would say that in our experience in cybersecurity, that's a trend we're seeing across the board. It's a show me, don't just tell me, it's trust but verify. Across the board in SEC, regulatory expectations, in the board, in management understanding cybersecurity programs, trust but verify, don't just trust but verify, and a show me, don't just tell me approach. And that's really why we wanted to bring this webinar to you today. We want to talk about evaluating cybersecurity and reasonable security, but also what are the artifacts of compliance and how do we demonstrate to regulators, business partners, management, and the board what our program is, how do we demonstrate that type of compliance and maturity. And in-house counsel has an increasing and critical role to play in all of this. We have seen legal take on more responsibility, not only in incident response, but also in cybersecurity preparedness. Now, looking at a company's information security program, InfoSec will often drive the building blocks and build out the technical controls of the program. But we're seeing legal playing an important role in determining and evaluating whether a company's information security program is not only reasonable, but defensible. I wanted to talk briefly to the format of our webinar today. Once we have introduced our distinguished panelists sitting to my left and my right, we will provide an overview of reasonable security standards. Then we will discuss how a company can evaluate reasonable security, applying common legal standards to the concept of reasonable security. And from there, we will discuss how a company can demonstrate reasonable security by outlining some common risk areas and associated artifacts of compliance that can be used to demonstrate the existence of reasonable security. Finally, we will talk about some practical tips and recommended practices to consider when tackling these issues. We also welcome your questions and have set aside some time towards the end of the presentation for Q&A. Thank you all for joining us, and let's get started. Once again, I'm Kim Peretti. I've been an information security professional and lawyer for 20 years. Much of my career was at the Department of Justice prosecuting hackers. Then I left to go in a non-lawyer role at PwC to build out some more technical expertise and manage a cyber forensics unit, and then joined Alston about 8 years ago now to help build out the cybersecurity practice. We are growing and have been continuing to grow, and I'm proud to introduce a partner to my left here in the DC office, one of our newer members from last year, Amy Mushawar.
Hi, nice to meet everyone in the room and online. I'm Amy Mushawar. I'm a member of our Privacy and Data Security Group. I have been in the technology sector in both legal capacities and then as a technology consultant and Chief Information Security Officer for about 20 years now. And I focus primarily on data security, incident response, and regulatory compliance. Given the practical CISO experience and technology experience, today in this webinar, we're going to take a more operational look at security and kind of help you understand what you can actually show and do to comply. And to Kate.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kate Hannaford. I'm a senior associate in Alston's data privacy and cybersecurity group here. My practice is cybersecurity compliance enforcement, as well as incident response. And my background is actually in securities regulation and enforcement, so I'm oftentimes focused on regulated participants such as broker-dealers and investment advisors.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Amy. Let's start by taking a closer look at the standards that apply to the concept of reasonable security and its evaluation. This won't be new to you, but more than half of all U.S. states now have enacted law requiring reasonable security measures, although their application may vary based on the type of business and or information collected. These have a very general security standard to maintain reasonable security practices and procedures appropriate to the nature of information and to protect personal information from unauthorized access. So this general standard is in most states, but we have seen and continue to see more and more states not only enacting that general language, but also having more specific and prescriptive language. Now, there's a few outliers, of course. For some time now, we've had Massachusetts and Oregon, Massachusetts requiring the implementation of a written information security program and outlining for the administrative, technical, and physical safeguards specific controls that are required. Oregon similarly has the requirement for a WISP, they call it, and as well as has 15 administrative, technical, and physical safeguards that can meet that requirement. More recently, we had New York with the New York Shield Act go into effect. The data security provisions in that act are effective March of this year. And it has that general standard, but it also specifies 14 components to achieve a compliant data security program. And I'll just identify for the technical part of that program that an entity is required to assess risks in network and software design, assess risks in information processing, transmission, and storage. So we're starting to see, states have experience in this area now and adapt their laws to what they feel is most important, which of course makes complying with overlapping jurisdictions more difficult. I'll also point out from the state perspective, Ohio, which is the only state now whose reasonable security law contains a safe harbor for tort claims that are brought in Ohio or subject to Ohio law. If the entity maintains and complies with an information security program that reasonably conforms to one of the more recognized industry standards frameworks that's listed in the statute, such as NIST or ISO. So that's an outlier state, but an interesting development. Of course, though, we're all here with CCPA on our minds, and CCPA has been in effect for a mere 2 weeks, so it's fair to say it's untested at this point, but it already has had a profound effect on the concept of reasonable security. And the reason for that is due to the private right of action in the CCPA, which is available, we know, to any consumer who's the subject of a data breach, as that's defined in the statute. Importantly, it's a unauthorized access plus exfiltration, theft, or disclosure, which is different from many state statutes. And as a result of the business's violation of the duty to implement and maintain reasonable security procedures and practices. So that is built into the statute. Of course, we've had many discussions now. We handle hundreds of incidents every year. And while many of them are the result of the lack of cyber hygiene and clearly wouldn't, pass muster under a reasonable security program, many of them are not. Many of them are the result of zero-day exploits, the result of a medium vulnerability that's been identified by the company and subject to a reasonable patching standard time frame, but hasn't been patched yet. So we have had many incidents occur for our client where despite having a reasonable security program in place, they're still subject to a breach. So it'll be very interesting to know and to think about how this is all going to play out, but makes the concept of understanding your program even more important. Of course, California is also the state that put out guidance about reasonable security from the AG's report in 2016, which identified the CIS controls, the critical security controls, as a minimum level of information security necessary. So we decided as part of this presentation today, we're going to highlight the CIS 20. We're going to demystify it and help inside counsel really understand how you can take that standard, that framework, and understand reasonable security or how to benchmark reasonable security from it. Finally, before we jump in, I want to talk about the FTC. We all are familiar that failure to have reasonable security could be an unfair or deceptive trade practice under the FTC Act. So over time, we've all been looking at the 50-plus, 60-plus now FTC enforcement actions in this area to distill and understand what constitutes reasonable security from their identification of inadequate security practices. So that's sitting out there, but importantly, after the LabMD decision, which struck down an FTC order as unenforceably vague, the FTC is still requiring implementation of a comprehensive process-oriented data security program, but now is also including in its orders, and this goes back to last year, many orders, more specific remedial measures tailored to the entity and the security deficiencies. So important from that, we have an article we had a post, alstonprivacy.com, we had a post on this particular topic earlier this week. We're having an article come out about it in a couple days, I believe, or maybe even tomorrow. But there's three primary areas where the FTC is strengthening its provisions, its order provisions. And one, as I just mentioned, is increased specificity. The second is really the most important for this presentation is increased accountability of third-party assessors to have specific supporting evidence for compliance. So again, back to the theme of documenting evidence. How can you show, how can you demonstrate you are compliant and you have the appropriate security in place? And then third, also important to highlight, which is on our screen here, is improved corporate governance, specifically C-suite and board level certification and review of compliance activities. All right, so let's go into a few questions to understand this, and I want to start with Amy. Amy, how do you analyze whether a company's data security is reasonable?
Oh, absolutely. I typically ask three basic questions, and they're based off of our regulatory experience and our enforcement experience. And it basically comes under, does a security program give structure and context to its program activities? And typically when you're assessed as an organization, you're looking at the standards that really create a security program, being ISO 27001 or the NIST CFS framework, the one where we all know the 5 standards of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Once you give your security program itself that governance framework and context, then as a company, you have to choose under what set of security controls. What is the punch list as the organization that you will meet per your regulatory obligations? And examples include, but much of this will depend on how you're regulated, what data you have. But NIST 853, the PCI DSS for those that have payment cards, the SAN CIS 7.0, which we'll be talking about today, and which is the standard for reasonableness in California, and has associated benchmarks and CAT tools. And then once you have a governance program, you have your punch list of controls. As a company, do you risk assess? And that question is truly being asked now by regulators, both state and federal. And, risk assessments, 5 to 10 years ago, we didn't really have a framework in order to risk assess other than the NIST framework that has been out for some time. But NIST, ISO, CIS, and FFIEC all have risk assessment standard frameworks and templates out. So when a regulator asks for a risk assessment, know that they're typically asking for a template and a set of standards for a risk assessment. Once we understand that, program, control, and assessment cadence, and then we will look at, over time, how is a company measuring progress, prioritizing its risk, and documenting its remediation from the output of all those risk assessments. And we'll talk about shortly how the overall CIS workbench standards and tools really make it much easier for you to do this in California.
That's great. So the 3 items then, program or framework, we've got the punch list, the list of security controls, risk assessment. 3 core principles there. Okay, great. Let's turn it over to Kate then. What are some of the more common challenges to evaluating whether a company's information security program is reasonable and defensible, and how do you overcome these challenges?
Sure. I think there are a couple of, or 2 real, I think, basic challenges that we see crop up a fair amount. One gating challenge really is companies that are subject to overlapping regulatory schemes and, business-to-business obligations. So, what's reasonable and sufficient, what can pass muster under one regulatory framework may not be sufficient in another jurisdiction, and what is good enough for one contract may not be good enough for other legal obligations by contract. So I think one way to overcome that kind of chaos is to actually perform a gap assessment, and that allows you to identify and specify the requirements to which you're subject, and then you can map your security to those requirements. And we would suggest doing that under privilege, because then if to the extent you do identify any gaps, that is covered by that umbrella of privilege as you identify and then work through those gaps. I think the second...
Before you move on, let me just ask, a lot of companies might say, I've identified all these different standards, but I'll just choose the one that's most stringent and develop my program around that. I'll ask either one of you, is that always the best way to proceed?
I'll give my opinion. For me, it's not always the best way to proceed, because oftentimes you need that flexibility with different portions of your network. So typically, what we ask our clients to do is to find a generally applicable standard like an ISO, like a PCI, like a NIST, map all of your standards, which many of these standards have pre-existing crosswalks that are put out by NIST, that are put out by CIS, so then you understand your regulatory obligations, and then you can choose where do you need more lenient standards for different portions of your network, provided, of course, there's segmentation between those.
Great. Sorry to interrupt, Kate. Yeah.
I think the other one is what we often see is how you evaluate unwritten but well-established company practices. And so if it's hard for in-house counsel to understand what is actually happening as a matter of practice, just imagine how hard it would be for a regulator or a third party who's understanding it. And from a regulatory perspective, I think we're increasingly confronted with the view that if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. And if it's not written down, it's very hard to evaluate it. So I think then for companies, the challenge becomes, if you do have a really good set of just unwritten practices, how quickly can you reduce those to writing, and what are they? And so that way you can kind of cobble together a set that's accurate, that's current, and then go from there as you mature your processes. And I think both this like patchwork of overlapping obligations and the reliance on unwritten practices, grow out of very practical concerns, which is that resources are finite. You have limited time, money, and people, but now it's really the time to step it up.
Absolutely.
And how I know we're talking about advanced security and having a more robust, mature programs in place, but we also know working with our clients at the same time, we sort of parallel, we have to constantly work on basic cyber hygiene. So, with this increased regulatory expectations, a wave of legislation, how should a company that finds itself behind the curve prioritize?
I think the answer there depends on whether or not they have done a risk assessment. If you have not done a risk assessment, we would recommend starting a risk assessment with a data inventory so that you can clearly, identify and thoughtfully identify what you have, what your crown jewels are, and the risks that are attendant to those. And I think within the past 6 months to a year, regulators have become increasingly unwilling to accept shortcuts to risk assessment and data inventories to identify what those exercises actually tell you. Even if your end conclusion is otherwise, it looks to be a very reasonable one, that process has started to really matter. But if you do have a risk assessment and you have a good handle on what you have and perhaps what those shortcomings are, then I think your next step is to consider the regulator and its track record for enforcement, as well as any stated guidance or priorities that it has listed, because a lot of times people are now, telegraphing what their enforcement priorities are. And I think also under the the regulator relationship, you want to consider what your regulator relationship is, because I think generally speaking, the goal is to establish credibility, to build that credibility, and to demonstrate candor. And so then you want to craft your responses and craft your projects accordingly. I think it's always helpful to tackle your deficiencies in some kind of priority order. And at the same time, don't forget about the quick wins or the low-hanging fruit, because oftentimes you can cross a lot of items off your list with not a lot of elbow grease. And I think that goes a long way to show action and that you're taking it seriously. It's incredibly important to make a remediation schedule or timeline and stick to it, because good governance includes the ability to meet those internal compliance and remediation deadlines. And though it's far from ideal, sometimes the best that you can do is actually document the identification of those shortcomings and your plan to remediate them. Because the best case scenario in that setting is that you have recognized that you have an issue and you have a plan to fix it, not that you have ignored it or papered over it or something like that. You can at least craft some sort of message of proactivity around it, but it does become that much more important that you can actually stick to your stated remediation timelines.
And I think an example I would give is we had a situation where a client had a vulnerability that was exploited by a criminal actor, but they had a patch management program in place that was very well defined, and they had identified that vulnerability as a medium risk vulnerability, and just, they had a longer time to patch. We were still well within the time frame according to our patch schedule to patch it, but it was exploited before it was patched, yet we could explain all that to the regulator, and the regulator ultimately said, okay, understood, because we had that appropriate program in place. So there was a little bit of understanding that things still can happen, but they're looking at the process, they're looking at the program, and as long as you have that in place, that's going to hopefully go a long way.
It was a win for reasonable.
Yeah, it was a win for reasonable. All right, Amy, what are some of the more cost-effective improvements a company can implement in terms of reasonable security?
Yeah, absolutely. And we realize this is a tough question because most of our clients have very, very, very large scale. But even for large scale and small scale companies, from a technical perspective, implementing multi-factor authentication, requiring strong passwords, especially administrative strong passwords, resetting passwords so they are unique and not a default password, are generally very cost-effective measures, and also scriptable and automatable depending if you're at scale. Automatic patching is initially resource intensive, but it pays dividends. So if you're a lawyer and your technologist is coming to you saying, I can't get resources in order to automate my patch cycles, that is money well spent, and you would have an ally with both in defending the reasonableness of your program to help him get resources or her get resources. In this regard, both passwords, multi-factor, patching are basic cyber hygiene elements that really can prevent much larger problems down the road. From a vendor risk management perspective, issuing vendor security questionnaires is not especially resource intensive, and the review of them may be outsourced entirely cost effectively. So if you don't have internal resources, that is something you can put outside your organization. I would also encourage companies to consider cybersecurity due diligence tasks at the initial contracting stages, as any flags identified early can be either priced into the deal or addressed pre-closing. And from a cost avoidance and also cost recouping perspective, both can be valuable. And lastly, tabletop exercises can be incredibly useful. Although they take time and outside counsel to conduct under privilege, the lessons learned from a tabletop exercise, just how the people around the room think through a problem, can pay off in actual breach scenarios, and then also let you know what you haven't thought about. And because breaches are so very common, a company is likely to have an opportunity to put those lessons learned to use.
So from a punch list perspective, I think what I'm hearing you say is focus on passwords, especially MFA. We know a lot of our breaches result in criminals having, access to usernames and credentials on the dark web and testing anywhere they can find to see if they can get in the front door in that way. Also, we work tons of vendor breaches, so focusing on your vendor due diligence or security questionnaires, because that is the process that will be asked of you if you have regulatory inquiry, right? It's not a breach on your systems, but it's a breach on your vendor. So what did you do to think about that in advance? M&A, cyber due diligence task, initial contracting stage, and then you mentioned, of course, tabletops. And tabletops are so critically important because we're working on plans, and plans are great. But in the event of a crisis, the plans sometimes go to the side, and you really want to know how those operate and not be a deer in the headlights, right? And the way that sort of muscle memory instilled in you is to do testing, to do the tabletop testing. So those are all great points.
And one point about multi-factor as well, oftentimes your IT technologist will tell you we've implemented multi-factor and may mean that they've only implemented it with your main login structure. You always want to make sure that you understand the gaps where multi-factor has not been implemented. So quite often we see breaches resulting from multi-factor not being on third-party tools where we might have a business email compromise. We also might not have multi-factor on administrative tools like a firewall login procedure or another administrative dashboarding tool, where literally if that's single factor, you now have an attacker who can get the keys to the castle.
Okay, so the demonstration, let's turn to the next part of the presentation here, the demonstration of reasonable security, the concept of artifacts of compliance. How do I produce that I have reasonable security in place? I want to turn it over to Amy. Talk about the building blocks of how to think about demonstration of reasonable security.
Absolutely, and it all starts with program governance and a WISP. 5 years ago when I started doing this, 12 years ago now, when I started doing this as a lawyer, folks were very reticent to provide a WISP, policies, procedures, anything other than an outline of that framework. Now it's very common for regulators to ask for your policies, your procedures, and your governing standards that resulted or that failed in accordance with a particular breach. But your basic WISP or written information security program includes the policies and procedures under an applicable governance structure. If your WISP is just a set of security controls, that is not a good WISP for an organization. It should be working both controls and governance so you can have measurement. It also will include dates of implementation, key modifications, and revision, and of course the corresponding executive approval for the document. Your WISP cannot be a standalone document though. It must also be integrated with your other policies. So you think about other corporate policies. For example, we have a financial institution in the room. So as I think of anti-money laundering, you should make sure that your anti-money laundering standards that match your access standards. As you think about what corporate policies to integrate, consider your codes of conduct, the standards within your employee handbook, and also the substantive standards that you must agree to as a sector-regulated company. We can't emphasize this enough, board minutes show program oversight by the board and your evidence that senior management is involved in your program. In addition to the WISP itself, a company should anticipate regulator requests for board minutes and briefings to both the full board and to specific board sections like an audit committee. We have seen in our regulatory examinations, also in oversight examinations by entities like the NYDFS, that those board minutes are reviewed, scrutinized, and you're actually interviewed against them. And then last but not least in program governance, a cyber budget. Where do you put your money? Regulators are increasingly asking for budget information for cyber ops, which can broadly be drafted to encompass both IT and InfoSec, including your team lists, your background information, and your training information. The information that you have amassed within both your budgets, your capabilities, your roles and responsibilities, that package can be used to assess whether or not you're thinking through cyber as an issue. Specifically to the cyber budget, there are now a lot of metrics that are floating out regarding exactly how much of your cyber budget should be dedicated to to your organization. Both Gartner and AT&T recommend 10% of your IT budget should be earmarked to cyber. For most organizations, that's 0.2 or 0.3% of company revenues for very large companies. For smaller companies, you may need greater proportions than that. So in addition to program governance, we are also expecting, and regulators expect, risk assessment. And I know that you've probably heard risk assessment at least 4 times already early on in this presentation. But risk assessments are very important because you should be prepared not only to ask whether or not, for a regulator to ask whether or not this is done, but for them to ask for a copy of it. This can serve as a roadmap to a company's data security priorities and should, for example, in the New York DFS, all of your cyber standards within your WISP and your controls should be based on risk assessment. Risk assessments also consider an organization's ability to adapt to evolving circumstances, both business-driven, threat-driven, and also legal changes in circumstances. Audits. In addition to general risk assessments, many large organizations are constantly audited for Sarbanes-Oxley, for different SOC reports. Companies can be asked for the results of their security audits and their internal audits, and quite often are in the process of oversight. Your evidence of implementation of both your risk assessments and your audit processes, as lawyers, ask for 2 things. Ask for whether or not you see a company risk register that is kept up to date at least quarterly. A risk register should be married to the specific risks that are coming off of both your risk assessments and your audits. If you're not seeing those remediation items on a risk register that is updated with an appropriate cadence, then know that that is something a regulator would red flag. Sometimes something is not, your risk register is not called a risk register, it's called a POAM. That's just a fancy way of saying a plan of action and milestone. That's just the NIST way of saying this, but it's the same thing. If you don't see the document, if you don't see it's updated with a regular cadence, and if it doesn't match your audit and your risk assessment priorities, as lawyers, those are the red flags we're looking for regulators. And then lastly, all big organizations have certifications you must meet. You're always going to be asked for those specific paper certifications, but more importantly, because now the certification process has gotten more rigorous, for example, with PCI, you might have a month to 3 months between the point at which you're originally risk assessed to the point at which you've remediated and a certification can be issued. During that period of time, you are vulnerable to being asked for that certification or to being asked for that initial initial report. So, we are counseling our clients that to make sure that you're initially gap assessing before you begin your formal process of certification. That will tighten up that time period where you're in remediation, and you might have to disclose that to regulators. And also, it will make that punch list, of course, much smaller that you'll ultimately have to fix.
So important on the risk assessment for all of us in-house, or all of us lawyers in-house, outside counsel. One important point is just to know now, to be aware of the fact that more and more outside parties will request your cyber risk assessments. So I often get asked from in-house counsel, how can I be more familiar with my company's cybersecurity program? I think it's a good practice to generally pick a few of the more important risk assessments that are done in this area and review them. There's 2 reasons to do that. One is to just become more familiar with the program. 3 reasons. The second is to identify the milestones and remediation plans and get a sense of whether the company follows through or how they follow through, because that's really where the regulators are going to be looking as well. And you want to get a sense of whether that's really going to be something that's going to be problematic if you have to produce it. And then third, there are occasions where some of these risk assessments, it makes sense to do them under privilege. Not all of them, but sometimes there's a core cybersecurity annual assessment. It might be after a breach It might be, now there's a new term, a compromise assessment, to make sure you're not, haven't been compromised so far. Those we generally would like to do underprivileged. So we're seeing more and more of assessments being done in cyber underprivileged. So it's another reason just to be more aware of risk assessments in general for your organization. All right, now we'll turn to really looking more closely at the CIS controls, which I love. I think that they do a good job in their own documentation of making it more digestible and sort of, understanding it for lawyers in particular. And love for you, Amy, to walk us through this slide.
Oh, sure. One thing I love about the CIS controls, and we are now on the 7th version of the CIS controls, but since CIS has started, it has always ordered its controls in order of priority. So as a former CISO, if I was to sit down in my organization and say, well, where do I begin? CIS gives you a wonderful roadmap of that. So if you look at the slide that we have up, the blue controls, controls 1 through 6 of inventory control and of hardware assets, software assets, continuous vulnerability management, controlled use of administrative privileges, secure configs, and logging are all considered the basic controls, the things that we expect all organizations in some form to implement. And then we have foundational controls and then organizational higher level controls. Within each set of these controls, though, and for those who are in the room, I'm going to hold this up. We can also distribute it afterwards. CIS has a very lovely guide that it's put out for several years now of indicating implementation control groups for green controls for moderate organizations, an implementation 2 group for those that have mid-level resources, and an implementation 3 group for those with larger cybersecurity budgets. So if you have, as a lawyer, if you have your CISO sit down with you and say, hey, we've got all this increased regulation, what documentation should I be working on first? Pull out the CIS controls and say, you know what? Basic green controls, those basic 1, implementation 1 controls, we must have done, because every single organization must adhere to those, and then just work out in terms of priority. We're going to focus on those first 6 because despite the fact that they're foundational controls, even large organizations with large cyber budgets have difficulty meeting them. So the first control, both CIS controls 1 and 2, speak to understanding your hardware and software assets with related inventorying. If there was a 4-letter word in security and we could jam the word inventory into 4 letters, it would be inventorying. Your IT departments hate inventorying, and I was continually told as an engineer it's not possible to keep that up to date. It's not possible to keep it done. It is possible. Typically, our more sophisticated organizations that do have up-to-date inventory are doing something, and if the lawyer's in the room writing it down, it's called an Nmap scan. That's called an enumeration scan of every single node on the network. If you don't know every node on the network, especially while you're patching, you don't know what you're patching. So typically what our larger organizations do is when they do their vulnerability scans, they do an Nmap enumeration scan, and then patch, and then validate, so that their inventories are always kept up to date on both hardware and software. Some of your organizations may say, I have things in the cloud. I have something called Docker. I have AWS Fargate. They're these little containers that build themselves up and take themselves down on a demand elastic basis. It is still possible to inventory those. You just have to inventory the existence of a demand elastic asset. It doesn't mean, sometimes I know that this is almost odd that we'd be having this conversation. It doesn't mean you have to count the number of servers as they go up and go down. That's not at all what we expect of our technology teams. We just expect them to recognize demand elastic assets. So inventorying can be done. Continuous vulnerability management. It is a basic control. It is very, very hard to do for big organizations. Typically, the artifacts that we expect and regulators expect, first of all, is an enterprise maintenance schedule that people are meeting. If you're not hitting your maintenance windows, if you're not scheduling your maintenance windows, or your maintenance windows are constantly ignored, those are signs to your regulators that continuous vulnerability management is not important. What does your scan tool reveal? Kind of like in a criminal law context, anything you say and do can be used against you in a court of law. If you open up your scan tool, and if you don't have context and you don't identify the deviations from your scan tool, anything that pops up on that scan tool can be used by a regulator to say, explain this. So let me unpack what that means on a really quick basis, but in a helpful basis. I have been a part of a regulatory oversight where a regulator asked to see our Nessus scan tool. Nessus is the vulnerability scan program of this particular company. And as lawyers, Nessus and Qualys are the two most common scan tools. When they popped up their scan tool, there were over 60 critical patches that were not done. Not because this wasn't a competent and cognizant organization, but because this organization had that portion of their network double air-gapped and also behind Cloudflare. So the particular vulnerability they actually had compensating controls for, but they never showed documented evidence, and we didn't unpeel this until a couple weeks later once we were able to investigate what those errors popped up from, is that there was a pre-existing compensating control. Now, you're saying, oh, we've explained it away, it was good, but every one of those items you have to explain away and research and allow a regulator to ask questions about becomes an opportunity for people to poke in a little bit further. It's better that you have what one of my mature organizations have, which is a spreadsheet or a database of deltas for your scan tools explaining where you've made deviations and compensating controls. Then, as lawyers, you can periodically request random samples of workstations, servers, and cloud assets and ask if they're patched. Those are very easy questions you can make to your organization. So those are a number of artifacts that regulators ask and that you can ask as lawyers to make sure your organization is protected. For the controlled use of administrative privileges, you might say, how on earth would I ever know as a lawyer whether or not admin controls are being used appropriately? A couple very simple questions. Your IT and your security organization should be regularly auditing its administrative controls, and you can ask your security professionals to log into a few interfaces in front of you. So the audits will be able to show you right away whether or not folks are in compliance. Being able to shoulder surf your security admins will tell you, okay, is this person logging in and staying under their typical username in order to administer administrative privileges, or are they switching to an administrative interface, or are they doing something to maintain security? You can ask questions as you shoulder surf, and that typically gives you not comprehensive information, but very good anecdotal information regarding how your administrative privileges operate within the organization. The fifth control of secure configurations has some very, very good artifacts of compliance. CIS, which of course is the standards we're talking about, they have benchmarks that you can load in as scan templates to both your Nessus and your Qualys tools. So CIS has predetermined configurations for Ubuntu, Windows, Oracle, for common use interfaces, so you know what a hardened configuration should look like. And if those scan tools and configurations have been loaded in, great. If they haven't, ask why they haven't. Is your organization using Windows tools or Windows rules in order to enforce their secure configurations? And are you downplaying as an organization? Sometimes you will shoulder surf and see your IT admin or security admin log into a Qualys or Nessus, and they'll say, oh, we fixed all patch vulnerabilities, but those configuration vulnerabilities, configuration is just a fancy way of saying computer settings, those don't need to be fixed. Configuration vulnerabilities can just as easily let a hacker get in as a patch vulnerability should. Both should be treated appropriately. And very simple question for lawyers and regulators to ask, are you following manufacturer's guidelines? Most of your network equipment and your major software equipment have hardening guidelines associated with them. It's quite common for a government auditor to print them out and see whether or not your appliance meets them. And then lastly, maintenance monitoring and the analysis of audit logs. I know that logs are also a very difficult topic, an expensive topic to broach, but your team should be able to show you on a random basis, if you pick out a few machines, how can I show that logs are on for the appliances that we care about? Can I show you the ingestion tool from our logs? And there should be, most especially for our mid-level and more sophisticated organizations, log audits are very commonly done, and you should be looking at those log audits because your regulators can ask for log audits as well, and regulators like the NYDFS do ask for log audit deltas. We hope that's helpful as you're trying to specifically evaluate what artifacts will actually show compliance or non-compliance. And as we're wrapping up this particular item, one of the things that we want to emphasize is for any of these items, any of your security dashboards can be viewed. So shoulder surfing is indeed appropriate now by regulators and commonly done by your regulators who indeed might hire security experts to accompany them.
That's great. Thanks, Amy. And on the next slide, before we move into some of the common questions that we hear and that we're going to address here, we've kind of sliced and diced this in a different way of the key risk areas that we see questions asked about. And there's 6 areas here: network and systems architecture, access controls, change management, project management, disaster recovery, patch and vulnerability management, vendor risk management. I know we've covered some of these along the way, but any one of them that you want to highlight or provide some thoughts on from artifacts of compliance standpoint?
Absolutely. Just a few of them, and because we spent so much time on the others, we'll give a little bit more short shift to these. But your network and systems architecture, oftentimes you can get almost into a battle with your IT and your security staff about what level of show me and mapping do I need to provide in order to give a comprehensive understanding. What we are constantly and should be looking for as lawyers is consistency. Can your IT team and your security team sit you into a room, pull out a map, walk you through an architectural map that won't show significant deviation if a regulator scans your architecture? And for example, if you have a PCI enforcement action where the card brands come in and you have someone called a PFI or forensics investigator come in, the very first thing they'll do is scan your architecture. So don't ever assume that if you've got network maps and system maps that are considerably out of date, that can easily be explained away, because it will initially show it's the very first thing that you present. It's the very first thing that signals to an enforcer and a regulator whether or not you are indeed a mature organization.
Sticking on that, and a lot of these network maps, right, are foreign because it's really hard to understand the system names and just the acronyms and various things. And sometimes you see a very, very high-level graph with 3 different environments and a couple systems and a couple arrows. Like, how detailed should these be? What should we be expecting to see and produce?
Well, and especially when you're looking at how does the network, if you're looking at, it depends on the circumstance. If you're looking at a regulatory oversight exam, for example, where you have a particular portion of your regulated network that is examined, you want to produce a network map that has that portion of your network. Or if you have an enforcement issue, you want to make sure the relevant portion of your network shows. You might have to, for example, it might be so high level that you have to log into systems or log into interfaces to show the regulator how things actually work and what things look like. That is okay. What we continually look for is, do you have inconsistency in whatever mapping that you have versus your technical architecture on the ground? And generally, are they consistent, and do they make it so your team can explain how your network actually works? So there is no punch list other than if you're in PCI and there's ports and protocol requirements, and there's actually network documentation requirements within the PCI punch list. But if you are within an organization, consistency is key on any type of enforcement action or regulatory oversight action. I'll flip through to access controls. Many of these we have talked about already, but the only thing I'd like to highlight from access controls is IP whitelisting and geo-blocking. If you say you're IP whitelisting and geo-blocking and you're doing it off of one appliance that, oftentimes in your path of communication out to the internet, you might be getting through several different appliances like a load balancer and a dual layer of firewalls. Make sure that you're explaining and that you have documented exactly what appliance controls what functions of your access control, because that can actually be a regulatory issue that takes some time to explain away and unpeel. And
on that topic, Kate, I know we were going to address on the next slide that exact question of access controls and details on how a company can show effective enforcement of its policies and procedures on access controls. Anything to add to what Amy just said from your experience?
Well, I think you can add, anything that can be logged easily and produced easily, such as like MFA. Geo-blocking tools are some of those as well that can be produced with relative ease. And I think she's right about the IP whitelisting and blocking, that sometimes you can actually show what's being blocked. So you can show that you are effectively blocking unauthorized access attempts based on those tools. But other things you can do for access controls include looking at what are the updated user materials or the training materials based on recent threats or other evolving or new information that you've received. That as you update your policies, they should be dated. You should be able to show them. And access controls are an area which I think it's fairly easy to show that. The one other category I think you could show is also the exceptions process, which in some ways is kind of a twofer because it shows that the business knows about the policies and procedures and they're following them, although you have an exception and they're asking permission, they want to engage in the exceptions process, and then you can show that security knows how to follow the exceptions process and document it, and then you can work in those compensating controls of what make it either an acceptable exception or in this case or in other cases not. But I think that can also be an effective demonstration of the actual enforcement of the program.
And you can commonly be asked too in terms of onboarding and termination. Questions regarding show us your most recent onboarding and terminations and show us that they've been effectuated across the organization. So those can indeed be times when people actually sat down at an audit table and we've discovered that there have been gaps. You don't want to be at the audit table or the enforcement table at the time at which you find that there are particular gaps. And as we marry access controls and things like system and network architecture, as we were talking about, for example, in that line of sight having a load balancer, if you don't understand your access controls and your architecture, I had in a breach once where we had a load balancer that was communicating with 10 different servers, and they only pulled the access logs for one server when the access logs should have been pulled for 10 servers. So architecture indeed matters. That's one of the things that we do is we're working enforcement actions and working breach actions is walking back through the systems architecture and looking at those artifacts for you.
We're at 5 minutes. I'd like to quickly have Kate address vendor risk management, and then we've basically addressed these questions, so we'll go from there right into the recommended practices. Okay. So vendor risk management, huge topic. Thoughts on how a company can mitigate risk and artifacts of compliance?
Sure. I think we talked about M&A and contracting a little bit, but this is one area where basic cyber hygiene and some due diligence goes a long way, both at the initial stages and the contracting and onboarding stages. So we generally recommend that a company issue security questionnaires as a matter of practice, and then also retain the right contractually to exercise periodic or ad hoc security audits. And I think that, and depending on the results of those audits, then you want to make it clear that the corrective actions that are imposed be completed within a given time frame. And I think some of those other, contractual provisions can be really, really helpful in terms of making sure that you have the rights to get the vendors where you want them to be. And that includes minimum security standards and, and tying those minimum security standards to where a violation of them becomes a material breach, and that you then, key indemnification provisions to any of those violations, any losses associated with them. And similarly to any data security incidents, and that you also build in notification provisions for any data security incidents as well, and cooperation provisions ideally as well, so that they are sharing information with you and working with you to resolve it, so that you have the visibility that you need into the vendor. And I think the last thing I would say about vendor risk management is that to the extent that you have built in those contractual rights, that you exercise them. It's if you are in the unfortunate but common experience of having a vendor breach, you want to be able to tell the story that you did exercise those rights, and you engaged in the oversight that you could do. That's much better than it being appeared to have been sleeping on your rights in that context.
And it's amazing how many vendor breaches we have that it turns out it's not the third breach. It's always like the third breach is the biggest breach, and then we do, more due diligence and find out that the information security team knew of things along the way. So I think the other important thing is to take mitigating steps after each incident. So at least if you can maintain that relationship, that you have a good, documentation of what you've done along the way to address concerns.
Mm-hmm. And also exercise your contractual rights.
Something I mentioned, your competitor would have a breach of their vendor, who's your vendor. That should be a tripwire for you to see.
Mm-hmm. So that knowledge you can gain in other ways means then you need to then take some steps.
And for this one, I think the mics aren't live everywhere, but the issue is that when your vendor also has a vendor breach, and that circle kind of comes back around.
Or your peer.
Yes, your peer has one.
You read about it in the paper, then that's a trigger for you to reach out, and also you will be attributed to not, to knowing about that. So we have just 2 minutes left. I think for recommended practices, I'll just summarize quickly and then turn to Amy for her thoughts. But all of what we're talking about today really does depend on cross-department coordination. It's legal working very closely with information security, as they need to in the event of an incident, as they need to in other preparedness activities. It's really going to be a joint effort. And as we mentioned, tabletops are one of the best ways to bring everyone around the table in a non-crisis, but tends to feel like a crisis, but it's generally not a fire, and work through issues and discuss issues. Everything we talk about in cyber risk is dynamic, has to be changing, adapting, flowing. That's the one thing that makes this enterprise risk different than other enterprise risks, is how quickly the cyber threat landscape evolves. So our processes, our programs need to adapt as well. I know in my former role over at PwC, one of the first things we did in our cyber assessments was threat modeling, helping companies understand what their defenses are on the current risks that they're facing, not necessarily the cyber risk from 5 years ago. And that needs to be a continuous process. And also information sharing and how you get cyber threat intel is important to help your program adapt. And adapting to trends in regulatory enforcement and civil litigation, certainly the core area for lawyers to really be able to come into an organization, stay on top of those the changing regulatory expectations, and they do change, and there's more regulators coming in at all times. I was just reminded to read and say the CLE code before we end, and it is for credit in New York. It's AB 011620. I want to just leave 30 seconds to a minute for Amy for any closing thoughts and to thank her so much for the presentation on the content here today.
Not a problem. I would say the one thing that's different between even 5 years ago is so much of what we do in security is now either embedded within a written standard, available to our regulators within our threat modeling templates or our threat software that we have, that our CISOs, our information security teams, are generating an awful lot of evidence that sometimes attorneys are and maybe might not be monitoring. So just as you go throughout this organization and throughout information security, we would just recommend you to kind of tangibly look at what is the documents your team is generating, and how would you look at your organization if you were a plaintiff trying to mount a class action against you, if you were a regulator trying to prove whether or not you're a reasonably secure organization, or if you're a business partner trying to evaluate your business for sale. Because, unlike, 5, even 10 years ago, a lot of this is written. There's a lot of evidence that we now know and other lawyers like me know to look for.
Well, thanks to Kate and Amy. Thanks to the participants today. We didn't get to Q&A, but if you have questions, we're available to email any of us, and we'll hopefully be able to get back to you shortly. Thank you for your time today.